Hello, everybody. So, we want to start off by not only acknowledging the land that we're on, but also spending some time acknowledging the history and the peoples of the colonized land on which we're working towards through the Decolonizing Library project. So, the DLP and its executive committee is physically situated on unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples in Toronto, Canada. So, giving a land acknowledgement only is not enough, particularly in light of the recovery of Indigenous children from the residential school systems inflicted upon them that we've been seeing in the past couple of weeks. A history that we essentially know has been inflicted upon them by the Canadian government. So our hearts bleed and our constant prayers are with our community members directly and indirectly affected by the atrocities, past and present, committed against Indigenous peoples on this land by settlers. The Decolonizing Library project looks towards decolonizing by means of land back and nothing less, and doing this, working towards practices, religious, cultural, social, and communal that work towards a just, equitable, fair, and righteous world for our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters.
So just a little bit about the DLP. We're a grassroots organization that works to counter colonial narratives by providing a variety of resources to the public so that we're able to better educate ourselves on the constraints and limitations of colonization in North America. So we work by sharing books, essays, scholarly content, and through the propagation of other creative outlets. The core of the organization seeks to provide direction and clarity to the audience on discourses that are laced with colonial processes. So our intention is to expand our outlook by decolonizing our knowledge. And through the content we publish, we want our audience also to grow and configure new modes of being along with us. And through this project, we actively work with our researchers in different academic disciplines, compile community resources for the database, and facilitate topical lectures that are accessible to the wider public. And that's what we're doing here today. So I wanted to just do a little introduction to our speaker today. Dr. Jason Idris Sparks teaches religion and global studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. In his research, Dr. Sparks applies a decolonial and transdisciplinary approach to examine Muslim traditions of being, knowing, and behaving west of Mecca, with a focus on Sufism. He holds a BA in religious studies from Concordia University with a minor in Arabic language and culture, and an MA in religious studies from the Université de Montréal, and a PhD in religion and culture from Wilfrid Laurier University. So welcome, Dr. Sparks.
Thank you. How are you?
Good, alhamdulillah. How are you?
Good. All right, let's see. I'm going to try something here. Let's see if my chair is more comfortable that way. I think this is good. Okay. All right, so shall we start?
Yes, definitely. I think you should be able to share your slides now.
Okay, I don't have slides. I've decided that I want you to concentrate fully on some semblance of human interaction here. Yeah, I thought, because our screens are already small enough, and then if we have the slide with this even smaller, face in the corner, it just becomes, I don't know, kind of dehumanized. I don't know. I do use slides sometimes, but I thought we'd keep it as human as possible here. Okay, so thank you so much, all of you for inviting me, for the Decolonized Library Project, for inviting me. And, it's an honor. I know all of you from before this project was even begun, so it's a pleasure to be working with you again. And the topic is dear to my heart. It's central to my research. So I'm happy to be able to present, some of the reflections and critical reflections that surround this topic from my studies and research. So my presentation, hopefully, we can have a presentation and then a good conversation maybe afterwards, because there's a lot of sort of theoretical material here. I think theorizing, formulating, articulating decolonial perspectives is important, because sometimes it's coming up with the proper sort of just way to look at something which helps us understand that's what I was feeling all along. So there's some theoretical concepts and some maybe new terms, neologisms that we'll discuss today that certainly helped me to formulate sort of some uncomfortable feelings I was having about some of the subject matter, and that gave me a way forward. But that means that when it's kind of theoretical and there's concepts like this, it's a little dense, it's good to be able to have a conversation after to unpack. So I'm hoping we can go for 45 minutes to an hour of presentation, followed by as long as you all can handle me. We can go until 2 a.m. if you like, but I don't know. My presentation's in 4 sections. The first is an introduction, and then we're going to discuss actually decolonial world systems analysis. What does it mean? And then we'll go into discuss what, the role of religion, the function of religion within the modern colonial world system. And then we'll end up with sort of what is my proposed framework to decolonize our understanding of religion, which, I call multiple approaches to reality. So, to begin, the term religion is generally used today as a category to designate peripheralized traditions of being, knowing, and behaving within the modern colonial world system. Peripheralized peoples in the contemporary global system are still confronted with colonial power dynamics in many aspects of our lives, including the pursuit of knowledge. This situation persists despite the end of direct European rule in most of Asia and Africa. Clearly, the birth of the so-called post-colonial nation state does not seem to have freed communities across the global South from colonial power dynamics. Similarly, the multicultural policies in places such as Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia have failed, particularly North America and Australia and New Zealand, have failed to eradicate racism or the ongoing extermination of Indigenous peoples and their traditions of being, knowing, and behaving. So perhaps it's too early to speak about post-colonial theory, and we should rather be speaking about decolonial theory, not only in settler colonial societies as such as Canada, but also around the world. It is too early to speak of a post-colonial moment. Of course, settler colonialism is clearly still a colonial moment in the terms that the European elites with European political systems, philosophical systems, languages, these people, my ancestors who came to these lands and invaded these lands, have not gone away and have not stopped dominating these lands. So these lands are still effectively under complete direct colonial rule. I speak to you from a sort of a liminal position, by the way. You'll find that I say us when I speak about the colonized and when I speak about the colonizers. This is because as a European, a person of European heritage who has converted to Islam, I find myself both in a colonized and a colonizing tradition. But as a Muslim, the Muslim project, the cosmopolitan view of Islam that has dominated, as hasn't always been cosmopolitan, but has dominated Islamic history, is a view in which the community that you choose is more important than the community from which you come. So as a Muslim, you identify with with your community. So generally speaking, when I say us, although my ancestors, I don't deny my ancestors, nor do I deny the privileges that I have for looking the way I look and for coming from the family from which I come and for speaking the language I speak. But I do consider myself as a member of a peripheralized community within the global system. So it's complicated, right? It's always, these colonial power dynamics find a lot of people often in liminal positions. As soon as you speak English, as soon as you have a Canadian passport, you have some sort of, colonial privilege. If you go to North Africa, you will see that North Africans, for example, their cousins who live in France, the people in Morocco or Algeria will say, oh, you guys are kind of, you have some colonial privilege, don't you? They might not use that term, but they'll let them know, So things are complicated. While it would be unjust, therefore, to declare that the great decolonial struggles of the 20th century a failure, right? We don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. What our predecessors were doing was worth something, and it was heroic. But we have to admit, that the notion that we live in a post-colonial era is farcical, since the process of decolonization is incomplete. Many scholars from peripheralized traditions find it difficult to articulate the ongoing colonial situations we experience in a way which both honors the struggles of our predecessors and addresses the urgency of our present challenges. To this end, it can be useful for the diverse peoples peripheralized within the modern colonial world system to learn from one another and consider the world from diverse viewpoints, some of which are classified as religions. As a Muslim, for example, I have learned a lot from Latin American decolonial world systems analysts who are the pioneers in the field. So let's go to the section on decolonial world systems analysis. So what I'm gonna suggest here is when I end a section, pressing questions like, I don't understand this. What on earth did you mean by that? Go ahead and ask them. But sort of more conversational, let's get this thing going. Maybe if you can take notes and leave that for the end, like after the whole presentation, that would be good. But yeah, so we finished the introduction. Does anybody have like a pressing question before we move on?
And feel free to like raise your hands on Zoom and I can let you speak, or feel free to use the chat or the Q&A box and we'll get to you in whatever capacity.
Pressing questions going once, going twice.
I think we're okay for now.
I heard a ding. I thought that was a pressing question. So Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, who died in 2018, he coined the term coloniality, Spanish colonialidad, to designate the ongoing complex colonial power dynamics established throughout the world over centuries by Western Europeans. Since the forces of Queen Isabella I of Castile, who died in 1504, and King Ferdinand of Aragon, her husband, who died in 1516, since their forces completed the conquest of Islamic Spain and began the invasion of America in 1492, the modern colonial world system has produced multiple entangled hierarchies, including race, class, and sexuality. These hierarchies have reorganized the way peripheralized people within the system eat, drink, love, work, and every other aspect of our lives, including, of course, how we think. Religions and religious institutions are part of this complex web of hierarchies. So the modern colonial world system, born in 1492 in the Atlantic world, spread across the globe gradually through a systemic and sustained effort by Western Europeans to exterminate both non-Europeans and marginalized communities in Western Europe. In the early modern period, these genocides targeted Muslims and Jews in what we now call Spain and Portugal, indigenous Americans, enslaved Africans, and European women accused of witchcraft. That's early modern, that's not medieval. As well as other peoples, such as the Guanches of the Canary Islands, exterminated around the time where Christopher Columbus, the genocide was complete by the end of the 15th century, just off the coast of Africa. And also, it also includes, the people who are often referred to by the problematic term gypsies, the Roma, right? Internal European colonization and marginalization in the world system. But so these are the genocides that begin the whole thing that we now call the modern colonial world system. The subordination and extermination of bodies, but also ways of being and behaving and knowing, right? For our purpose, it's important, therefore, to note that these genocides did not only exterminate bodies. They also sought to annihilate knowledge traditions. In short, the genocides were also what we call epistemicides, the annihilation of ways of knowing, which produced the epistemic hierarchy in which dominant Western ways of understanding reality attempt to erase the intellectual traditions of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and all other people peripheralized in the modern colonial world system. Coloniality of knowledge refers to this epistemic hierarchy established by European Christians and later perpetuated by secular humanists. Right? So you have the coloniality of being, the coloniality of power, and you have the coloniality of knowledge, which establishes hierarchies in the way we understand this thing called reality. At first, the system of death, euphemistically known as modernity, was legitimized by the radically exclusivist ideologies within Christianity, which produced the Crusades and the Inquisitions. Roman Catholicism was weaponized against all other traditions, especially Islam. Indeed, modernity was very much born as an anti-Muslim project. Right? This is important, and we can hopefully one day have a separate, conversation just about that, the anti-Muslim roots of modernity. You see, Muslims had surrounded Western Europe and were trading with China and Africa and India, and Western Europe was like the boondocks of the boondocks. It was super marginalized, right, in this sort of, what we call a continent, but was really a subcontinent, Western, a very small part of the world. And the Europeans had been surrounded after the end of the Western part of the Roman Empire. Western Europe was having a lot of geopolitical instability and just did not have that level of technological, architectural, cultural advancement that they would see when they were interacting with Muslims. When they went for the Crusades, they were like, what is going on? These people are so, and the Europeans came to this, we are in a dark period here. We need a renaissance. We need to be reborn to become like these other more advanced people that we keep coming in touch with, right? So if you see the logic of the Renaissance, it is one of catching up and going and the very fact that Christopher Columbus is sent across the Atlantic, it is very clear. You can see in the correspondence, it's available. You can go and read his journals, right? It's very clear that this is part of a project to find other trading partners without having to go and deal with Muslims. Because for the longest time, if you wanted to trade with India or China or sub-Saharan Africa, you kept having to go through Muslim lands or Muslim brokers, or and so it's an anti-Muslim project to begin with, right? Anyway, so over time, though, Catholicism was the first sort of weaponized tradition. Became very much a colonial ideology. I'm not saying that's what Catholicism is, but it was weaponized as an ideology of power and coloniality. But over time, secularism gradually replaced Catholicism as the hegemonic discourse of modernity. Protestantism maybe made it in there in between, right? Okay, so it's important to understand that the modern colonial system continues to exist through today. Like I'm talking about the emergence, but what's important to understand is that it continues to exist today through the perpetual and ongoing annihilation of peoples, knowledge systems, and ecosystems, right? Because that's another aspect, ecocide. What we call the Anthropocene is very much a colonial thing. It wasn't, the cataclysmic destruction of the environment really begins in the early modern period and accelerates as modernity accelerates, right? So it's part and parcel of a system of death, of a system of destruction, of a system of annihilation, of a system which gathers all of the goods from and wants to use them but not pay the bill. You know what I mean? We want to eat but not have heartburn, overeat but not have heartburn. There's a pill for that, and everything else. We want. There's a pill for that. There's a machine for that. There's an algorithm for that, right? So this is the logic of modernity, and so when I speak about the perpetual annihilation of peoples, knowledge systems, and ecosystems, the terms, we're talking about genocide, epistemicide, and ecocide. Right? These are the motors of the ongoing motors of the modern colonial world system. Now, do I mean that everything in this system is destructive and that any time you look at your phone, that you listen to it's Vivaldi, that's early modern, that's very colonial. I'm not saying that every experience of modernity is essentially colonial or reducible to a colonial thing. But what I'm saying is it's tainted by and affected by and reorganized through coloniality, whether we like it or not. There's no escaping. It has become the global world system, right? So everybody's positioning themselves within this system at this point, right? So coloniality, to come back to this word coined by Aníbal Quijano, it's a useful neologism, right? We were speaking about new words, new concepts. Doesn't mean colonialism, right? It's its own thing, and it's useful because it offers a clear and concise way to express observations about the evolving modern colonial world system, which began in the Atlantic world and progressively globalized. When anti-colonial movements swept across the world in the second half of the 20th century, Western powers responded by transforming global colonialism into the current regime of global coloniality. We went from a regime of global colonialism, direct colonial rule, to a regime of global coloniality under which we still live. Despite the end of direct European rule in most of the global South, today's global regime perpetuates and consolidates Western political, economic, cultural, intellectual, and spiritual hegemony or hegemony. It's enforced by such organizations as the UN, the IMF, the WTO, the NATO, and the ubiquitous US-American military. But it's also enforced by, more subtly by Disney, Coca-Cola, and the countless institutions spreading Western languages and cultures, including most of the universities we went to, right? In Morocco, where I lived for a beautiful period of my life, and I still go to as often as I can, and where my in-laws live, there's an Institut Français, an Instituto Cervantes, an American language center in every major city, as well as countless academic institutions offering Western degrees. You don't find a Moroccan cultural center in every major city in Canada or France, you see, right? Or England or the States or Spain, right? Such institutional networks perpetuate the domination of subaltern peripheries, including racialized minorities in the West. Right? Racialized minorities in the West are subaltern peripheries. And the domination of these peripheries by the Western colonial core, which, by the way, includes Westernized elites outside the West. It depends whose interests you represent. There are people in Morocco, Haiti, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, whose entire life is devoted to preserving and perpetuating the modern colonial world system and assuring their survival as representatives of this system within their country, and so you have these people who are basically, when the French left Morocco, for example, they basically moved into their houses, took over their offices, literally sat behind their desks. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they started wearing their actual shoes and underwear that they left behind. They just became, in many cases, exactly the people they just kicked out. So the project for some people was to kick people out to become them, right? To become the representatives of French power in Morocco, for example, and become the managers of, French institutions and go and get free trade deals and all this, right? So Let me go back. Such institutional networks perpetuate the domination of subaltern peripheries, including racialized minorities in the West, by the Western colonial core, which includes westernized elites outside the West. Right. So it's not, it's a bit deterritorialized. Right. You can't just stop it at a border and say this is where, in other words, anybody here in the West would be, a colonial elite, and that's just not true. We know that, right? So from its core, the world system seems modern, but it seems colonial from the periphery. Perception is crucial here, and it should be noted that our epistemic perspective is more significant than our social position in determining how we perceive the system. If we adopt a Eurocentric epistemic perspective, as do, unfortunately, many scholars socially situated in the periphery, modernity shows us its hopeful face. But if we adopt a peripheral epistemic perspective, coloniality reveals itself as the other face of the same coin, or the underside of modernity, which is why decolonial world systems analysis speaks about the modern/colonial world system. Modern/colonial. In other words, it depends which side you're looking at it from. You see, when people come in enthusiastically, for example, in Morocco, when people in the French speaking press in Morocco say, we need to modernize, we need to modernize, we need to modernize, others will hear in Morocco, we need to westernize, we need to westernize, we need to westernize. You see, they're translating. One person's speaking about modernity, the other one's understanding coloniality, right? So so I'm not saying, once again, that everything that has to do with modernity is entirely colonial, right? But when seen from the periphery, that colonial aspect is always there. You can't either escape it completely, right? So this is what is meant by the modern colonial world system that we still live in. Coloniality, therefore, is the regime of entangled hierarchies. It's the actual regime of power, which is Western centric, right? Which was emerged with colonialism. Colonialism created it, but what happened in the middle of the 20th century is direct colonialism disappeared, but the coloniality, the entangled web of power, actually was in some cases consolidated. Why, for example, send my army somewhere when I can have an army of people there doing it? Why send my own managers and engineers when I can have a local elite comes to Columbia, McGill, U of T, whatever, gets trained and goes and serves my interests back in their country? There's another way of perpetuating coloniality without necessarily being burdened by the expensive and dirty work of direct colonial rule, right? Getting your hands dirty, torturing people in Algeria. Why would any, white secular humanist want to do that? Let the Algerians do that, right? You know what I'm saying? Shifa, you know what I'm saying? Okay. All right. And now, so world systems analysis, therefore, right? So world systems analysis, we already had world systems analysis, people like Immanuel Wallerstein. Decolonial world systems analysis is what we've been talking about, very much developed by the Latin school, right? Who worked with Immanuel Wallerstein, who loved Immanuel Wallerstein in many cases, and he loved them. But what they wanted to say is, yeah, we want to analyze the world system in terms of a system, but we want our analysis to be clearly and explicitly decolonial. And it comes from a different lineage, therefore, than, for example, post-colonial theory. So the critique of post-colonial theory from decolonial theorists would be that post-colonial theory, first of all, is mistaken in the idea of a post-colonial world, but also that the framework is epistemically, it's still criticizing Eurocentrism using Eurocentric frameworks. Deconstruction, postmodernism, Foucault, Derrida, whereas the decolonial project attempts to go and look at the world from the epistemic perspective of other traditions. Therefore, although it's actually genealogically comes very much from a Marxist background, the decolonial world systems analysts are trying to say, no, what does the world look like from a Muslim perspective? What's a Muslim critique of the world rather than a Marxist one or a Foucauldian one? What's a Hindu critique of the world system? What's an Anishinaabe critique of the world system? What does the world look like from other traditions? Rather than saying, I'm socially located in India or Pakistan, but I'm constantly drawing on frameworks that come from the Western Academy to actually deconstruct the Western Academy. So these are the sort of theoretical issues I wanted to get into before I speak about religion in that modern colonial world system. I hope it's been clear, but let's stop now at the end of this section and see if there's any questions about this sort of dense theoretical stuff. And while you're seeing if there's any questions, I'm going to go grab a little thing to drink.
So again, feel free to obviously raise your hand to ask any questions. Or use the chat box or the Q&A box, whichever you prefer. I also will reserve some of my questions till the end.
But if you have like burning ones, which you think would help the thing right now.
They're like, I think the way that you frame not using Western epistemic like frameworks towards the Decolonial project. One of the critiques of the decolonized project or decolonized library project would be that that's exactly what we do. And so I will leave that to later, but it's something that we should talk about.
Well, good, Shifa. I'm just, no, no, but it's an attempt, it's an attempt. You can run, but you can't hide, coloniality is there, right? But yeah. I feel like I'm having a conversation with Shifa and Fatima because they're the only people on my screen. But I think we got 7 other people now in the house. Okay, good stuff.
Zen Sayed asks, please, can you clarify your criticism of post-colonialism compared to a decolonial world system?
Okay. Well, let's say the critique that appears within the Latin American decolonial school, right? So which is rooted more in Latin American and Caribbean experiences, often very much to the left, a materialist genealogy, by the way, it's a Marxist genealogy. So not one in which you kind of question reality, it's a very different genealogy. But anyway, the critique that comes from these people, which I hear loud and clear, or loudly and clearly, is that post-colonial theorists are our friends. We like post-colonial theorists. They're doing important work. We're so happy they came about. Without them, we could not, however, the critique is, we believe that much of post-colonial theory is problematic and can be critiqued on 2 terms. First is the very idea of a post-colonial situation. Once you see, this is the thing, right? We didn't have the language to say what Aníbal Quijano said when he said colonialidad, coloniality. Once you had that word to describe ongoing colonial situations despite the end of colonial administrations. Once you understand that, then you can't speak about a post-colonial period in India or Pakistan or Morocco or Egypt. Of course not in Canada, but anywhere in the world, because the colonial structures, the power structures, the dynamics, the usual suspects are still on the bottom, you see. Right? So that's the first thing. Even the very idea of a post-colonial world is premature. The second critique is one which is, it's not like that you were bad to do this. It's one that maybe it was inevitable. The epistemic, the coloniality of knowledge is so deep that it might take a few generations to realize one's own internalized Eurocentrism, right? But the critique is that some of the first generations, especially in the English-speaking world, which is where the post-colonial critique comes from a lot, is deeply epistemically indebted to an entirely Western genealogy. You have a couple of Muslim sounding or Hindu sounding names there, but if you go just one name above and who taught them, who taught them, who taught them, it's all European secular thinkers. And so the idea is, well, that's great, you know, postmodernism, is an attack on Eurocentrism from within the West, right? It's an attack on Western-centric reality from within Western-centric reality using the tools of Western thought. Post-colonial theory comes in and sort of does the same thing, but socially positioned on the periphery. But a lot of the time, they're still using the thoughts, the templates, the go-to logic remains nearly always, you know, Foucault, Gramsci, Derrida, Marx, Nietzsche, Weber, like, you know, you can't get away. And so that is the critique. It's still too indebted to these genealogies, right? And when we speak about genealogies, it's not a problem of whether you're physically, like, you know, Derrida was North African, you know. He was, you know, but it's not about where you were born or where your genes are from. It's where I'm going to try and wrap up my answer here, but remember I said epistemic location is more important than social location. It is possible for me to be in Nigeria and consider the world from a European perspective. In fact, many scholars do that in Africa and Latin America. They look at the world as if they were Europeans. They speak about Europe expanding rather than Europe arriving, right? It is therefore technically possible for us here in the core to try and look at what does the world look like from another, you know, epistemically kind of at least try to think of things from other angles. So we're not completely 100% limited by our social positionality. We can choose to try to change our epistemic location. Does that make sense? Sayed was the Zain Sayed.
Yeah, Zain Sayed. Okay, and then we have a really good question also in the Q&A box, but I think we are going to leave it till the end because it is a really good question. And it might be a good, like, summarizing. Maybe we'll bring him on to ask his question live.
Right, please keep that question, and if we forget, you remind us. Okay, all right. Now let's talk about religion, right? In the modern colonial world system. So I'm going to go to a religious studies professor called Peter Bayer, who talks about globalization, religion and globalization. He's a Canadian professor in Ottawa, and he draws upon world systems analysis. I wouldn't call him by any means a decolonial world systems analyst, but he does quote some decolonial world systems analysts, such as Walter Mignolo. But anyway, he does use this world systems analyst framework a little bit to position religion within the global system. And so what he says is religions are subsystems of a global religious function system interconnected with other function systems. Political, military, legal, economic, academic, language, fashion, artistic, literary, athletic, function systems. You see, the globe has all of these function systems. The fashion industry, right? The world of fashion, the domain, the field of fashion, the field of literature, you know, all these English language schools, right? You know, these are fields, and religion is a subsystem, just like the economy, just like politics, just like the military, just like fashion, just like sports, and religions are subsystems within that function system. So it's the understanding of the world having religion as one of many systems, and religions as you know, subclass of this system. And what do we do with religion? And what do we do with religion versus the economy and versus politics? That sort of way of categorizing the world is a very modern colonial way of categorizing the world, right? These systems are supported by various organizations and social movements. Religions and religious movements are its subsystems. In systems theory, a system has patterns and particularities, but it is neither universal, it didn't have to happen, nor is it predictive, right? So in other words, we're looking at things the way they are, these systems, and systems which emerge over centuries can seem like they're immovable, and they can be sort of immovable for a couple of generations. It takes a while to, something that's evolved over 500-600 years, you can't get rid of over a generation, which is perhaps why we need to be charitable to decolonial efforts of the previous generations. this stuff has been going on for a long time. To break out of this is, our kids are probably going to be looking at us as being extremely colonial but anyway, so religion is a subsystem within, along with the economics, politics, fashion, sports, etc. Religion is therefore a contested category disputed along two broad lines. And now I'm going to quote him. One of these two broad lines is the difference between religion and non-religion, which is to say how the religious field is delimited and thus created. The other is the contrast between one religion and another, in particular the question of whether something is or is not a religion. Not just if it is a religion, but more centrally, if it is one of the religions. So you see, once you have this category of religion, then you start wondering, well, is this a religion? Is that a religion? Is that a custom? Is that a way of being? Is that a way of life? Is that a religion? And if you get to be called religion, then you get into a certain legal, then your relation to other subsystems, such as the law, suddenly you have freedom of religion, you see? Right? If I'm a religion, then then what I do is my business, right? So if, for example, indigenous customs and ways of being in a certain region are called religion, then they can defend themselves in the American or Canadian legal system under the Constitution. However, if a white dude comes and wants to do the same thing as you're doing and go to your sacred space, the white dude might say, look, it's my religion. It's my personal conscience. I'm doing this because it's my religious belief that I have to. And suddenly you're stuck in the parameters of religion as a private individual freedom rather than a collective custom, which would bring other challenges. So you see what I mean? It's a contested category. When is something called religion? And what happens when something gets called religion? Is this a religion? Is it not? Right? Like nations or cultures, religions represent powerful and socially consequential abstractions, which manifest themselves in particular identifiable forms, such as religious organizations or religious movements. They're ideas, right? Abstractions, which manifest actually materially. These religions, which together form the global religious system, have institutions and power dynamics which are internal and external. They influence and are influenced by other systems. Religion influences the law, influences the economy, influences fashion. Fashion influences law and economy and religion, and so forth. It's interactive and dynamic. Now, Bayer tells us modern systems are generally reconstructions and reformulations of earlier systems, not completely new constructions. And I think this is a really important point he makes, because you have some authors, those of you who are interested in it, you can go find out, but you have some authors who are like, the modernity invented religion, invented religions. And people will be like, I don't know, I kind of find stuff that, it's there before, right? So the idea of a complete invention is sort of counterintuitive, and it's not really true. What modernity comes, the modern colonial world system, like any world system, comes in and it finds things that are there and it reorganizes them in a way in which there is both continuity and difference. Therefore, what we now call Hinduism or Taoism or Confucianism it doesn't quite mean the same thing because as it used to, but sometimes those words didn't even, but it still refers to some of the stuff we're referring to as stuff that's been going on. It was there before modernity, So what we now call Hinduism, they didn't call it Hinduism. They didn't refer to themselves as Hindus in the pre-colonial period, right? But the things they're doing, a lot of it they were doing before that, right? But in order to really understand that sort of tension between continuity and difference, you have to look at, well, what is it opposed to? I'm religious as opposed to what, for example? Or I'm Muslim as opposed to what? Or I'm Christian, what does it mean as opposed to what? Okay, and this is important stuff to look at. So it's reconstructions, reformulations, and the dynamics between all these systems and coloniality makes it a new thing. in many ways, while it is still an old thing, okay? So it's recognizable and not. Modern religions were generally not completely constructed or invented in the modern period, but reformulated and reconstructed. Even the formulation of non-religions, I don't know, Confucianism, for example, or systems framed as local customs or practices, they are part of this overall system as soon as they're in the discourse, you see. See, for example, New Age spirituality, which both encompasses and rejects elements associated with what we call religion. Is it a religion? Is it not? Well, it's part of that subsystem. As soon as we're questioning, as soon as we're trying to categorize it as religion or not religion, or half religion or part religion, right? What is categorized as religious or not is part of this system. And so a lot of the things, for example, Muslims might say, yeah, we've always had religions, Muslims, Jews, Christians. Okay, maybe. Maybe, I don't know, do you have an exact translation? What would be the exact translation? And does it mean exactly the same thing, as in it is not this, not that, as it did before? For example, I know a lot of Muslims, interfaith dialogue, they will not want to discuss with certain people who present themselves as religions, because they'll say, no, these are not Samawi, they're not religions of the book, therefore they're not religions, they're philosophies, they're something else. Because in the traditional classical Islamic nomenclature, we're trying to stick our word religion to what they were describing as Ahl al-Kitab, which is not quite the same thing. Anyway, so you see things don't always fit exactly. But in any case, my argument to you here, building on Bayer and appreciating Bayer, is that it is time for thinkers from peripheralized traditions to realize that the Western theoretical frameworks were not developed in response to our needs. Without destroying or completely ignoring Western secular thought, it is in our interest to decenter it in our work and to treat it like any other intellectual tradition. Referring to Western or Westernized secular scholars in our research should ideally be optional, just as we do not feel obliged to cite Southeast Asian Buddhist thinkers, for example, right? If you present a paper, your professor is never going to say, well, Shifa, you presented a paper on the Muslim community in Toronto. Why are you not referring to any Confucians? But I can guarantee you that any university in the world, if you don't refer to some major Western secular thinker, they'll be like, what's going on with your papers? You're not mentioning the masters in the field, you see? It's not optional, right? So what I'm saying, it should be optional. You want to talk about secular thinkers? Good, go and do it, right? But why not also, instead, why not have a dialogue between Taoism and Sufism, for example, which Professor Chittick and Murata do, for example, okay? So you see that some people are doing that good work. Referring to Western or Westernized secular scholars in our research should be optional, and because often infatuation with Western secular thought prevents us from exploring other approaches to reality which deserve our attention. Yet many of our minds remain deeply colonized. Our own minds are colonized by secular humanism, you see. We grew up in this stuff. We drank it, right? Western secular forms of thought established a hierarchy with science at the top, closely followed by Christianity, and then a descending order of so-called religions, beliefs, customs, superstitions. You don't see my hand here, but I'm going lower and lower, right? Magic at the bottom, voodoo, this hierarchy with maybe Protestantism as the very, very top, if you're going to German and English speaking, right? And then Catholicism, and then Judaism, and then Hinduism, and right at the bottom, you'll find African religions and indigenous religions, and indigenous religions from around the world. So this is the way Western secular thoughts established this hierarchy. And still today, science and Western European forms of Christianity are associated with people from the core of the modern colonial world system, while all other approaches to reality are associated with peripheralized peoples. Various hierarchical subsystems, such as science, culture, class, and sexuality, overlap in a complex colonial web centered around race. You see, when you look like me and you become Muslim, you get racialized a little bit differently. You look the same, you sound the same, but when they hear you speaking Arabic and they see your wife has a scarf, and wait a second, your racialization gets different. Things start to shift. So race, this is an important point. Decolonial world systems analysis says that race is the central hierarchy around which all other hierarchies revolve. And by the way, there are different triggers of what race might be. The main trigger in the United States is color, right? But the main trigger has not always been color. It can be different things. So the initial racism, the first time the word race was used for human beings rather than horses, was in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition in relation to Muslims and Jews. Because what they were looking for is people who had converted to Catholicism in order to escape persecution, but that were actually closet Muslims and Jews. And so they say that person's race is Muslim. They say they're Christian, but let's bring them into the Inquisition to see if they're really Christian, you see. And how are we going to find out if they're Muslim? Well, maybe they're a bit dark, maybe they have an accent, maybe they don't go to work on Fridays. There's all these other markers, right? But the initial using of the word race, what you might call proto-racism, is in the Spanish Inquisition, and it is attributed to Jews and Muslims. So is Islamophobia and Judeophobia forms of racism? You bet you are. You bet they are. You betcha. Okay, they are, right? This is the initial form of racism, right? So there are different identifiers. Race, you see, in the old days, what happens is after the invasion of the Americas and this new power dynamic, this is a whole other lecture I'd love to get into, but what happens is the Europeans, rather than othering others as worshiping the wrong way, as being heretics. By the way, Muslims were not considered another religion. They were considered a heresy, you see? It wasn't, oh, Muslim religion, Jewish religion. No, it's the heresy of the Saracens was what we call Muslims as Muslims, right? So rather than the hierarchy and the othering, and I'm going to kill you because you worship the wrong God or you worship the wrong way, I now kill you and dominate you because you are inferior to me along the lines of your humanity. You are subhuman or non-human or beastly. You're chattel. You're an object. Or you're a human, but not at the same stage of evolution. The line becomes human. That's why now we talk about dehumanization as the absolutely worst thing you could do to somebody, because the human is the hierarchy, is the central thing all of a sudden. That's racism. That's modern colonial racism. Before that, you don't have that. You have color prejudice. You know, you have genealogy prejudice, you have all sorts of other forms of othering, but modern colonial racism is around the line of the human. In other words, if you convert to Christianity, you will still get getting kicked out of Spain, which is what happened to the Moriscos. When the Spanish were done, when they kicked out the Muslims and they kicked out the Jews, they then eventually kicked out everybody who had Muslim or Jewish ancestry. Doesn't matter if you're Catholic. Right, indigenous people and Black people who became Christian in the colonies of the United States and Canada and Latin America, they didn't gain the same status as white folks. It's now along another status. Your changing religion won't change, right? That's the racialization. And people don't hate us now as Muslims, for example, because of our theology. They could hate Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons if it was about theology. They don't just hate us because of theology. They hate us because of a whole bunch of implications, which makes them think that by being Muslim, you are less human, less evolved, at another level of, or perhaps not even fully in the human family. You see, it's racialized, right? So religion is one of many markers used to racialize humans, along with language and, of course, skin color, right? A white, blue-eyed, blonde Latin American arrives in the United States and sees on the census, are you Latino or white? Right? They start speaking, the person like, you're Latino. They hear the accent, right? It's a marker. Global decolonialization, therefore, requires contesting and replacing such modern colonial categories. Instead of conceptualizing religions revolving around and organized by science, we should simply acknowledge that to approach reality, human beings draw upon diverse ways of being, of knowing, and of behaving. Right? Now, another author, I'm going to start moving a little faster here. Another author who can help us deconstruct and decolonize modern colonial understandings of religion versus secularism is Saudi-born British anthropologist Talal Asad, T-A-L-A-L, Asad. So In a book called Genealogies of Religion that he wrote in 1993 or published in 1993, he says that religion as a universal concept is a construction of European modernity that serves certain forms of history making. The idea that secularization transforms totalitarian repressive religion into a privatized and relatively harmless institution, this idea justifies liberal political projects and worldviews in opposition to political religions that threaten modernity and reason. You see, it's a regime by constructing something as religion rather than secular, right? Assad, what he does is he, as an anthropologist, he examines Western Christian and post-Christian history and how concepts developed in this context come to be applied wrongly to other contexts, such as Islam, right? The hegemonic influence of Western history around the world makes it crucial to consider the West as a peculiar place with correspondingly strange worldviews and intellectual categories such as religion versus secular. You see, we're used to anthropologists saying, I wonder what Muslims eat in winter. Oh, the Hindus, do they hibernate? You know, it's like this way of, this is a peculiar thing we're looking at here. What Assad says, he turns it around and says, these secular humanists, what a particular bunch of people with a very unique view of the world. Let's try it. And so he says, we need to turn this baby around because these people are imposing their categories on everybody else. Let's look at them as historical and particular and weird and strange and interesting and exotic. In the West today, so for example, he says the secular and the religious, therefore, in this context, they define one another by delimiting their boundaries. He says from the 6th to the 12th century, the term religious, now I'm quoting him, was applied only to those living in monastic communities. Then it came to be applied also to non-monastic orders and lay people who had taken special vows that differentiated them from the regular laity. The gradual expansion of religious discipline across the laity after the 12th century represented an expansion of church authority across society. So my point is here, is that when they used to say religion in the West, or you're religious, they meant you were a priest or a monk or a nun, right? It didn't mean not secular. It meant you were a lay person. It had a different meaning. When somebody said you were Christian back in the day, it meant you were Christ-like. Anybody who had a little bit of honesty, I'm not Christian. No, not at all. I mean, you should see me. I'm because it was a big compliment. I'm Christian. That's saying you're Christ-like. You see, these words didn't mean what they mean today, right? And this is important to understand this because what it means now is not what it has always meant. In the West today, intolerance of Europe's others has again become more strident. He says this in 93. He says collective cruelty is, of course, neither new nor confined to the West. Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and Christians continue in our day to perpetrate acts of violence and cruelty. But it is the secular modern state and its awesome potential for cruelty and destruction that deserves our sustained attention as citizens and anthropologists of modernity. He said, yeah, Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and Christians do a lot of atrocities, but the modern nation state, count the deaths. All right, we got Stalin in there. We got our buddy Rumsfeld who just died. We got a lot of corpses under the secular modern nation state, right? He says modernity is a project, or rather a series of interlinked projects that certain people in power seek to achieve, right? And it aims at institutionalizing a number of, sometimes conflicting, often evolving principles. And he quotes constitutionalism, moral autonomy, democracy, human rights, civil equality, industry, consumerism, freedom of the market, and secularism. This is a project. It's a dirty, messy project with internal conflicts, right? But it's a project, right? And it employs technologies, proliferating technologies, he says, of production, warfare, travel, entertainment, medicine, that generate new experiences of space and time, of cruelty and health, of consumption and knowledge. This is a regime, right? It's a new way of approaching reality. But the secular, like everything else, is unstable and has multiple genealogies. It works through a series of oppositions that would not make sense in any other time or place, such as medieval or early modern Europe. You see, there's a bunch of, what Assad tells us is today we will say like belief, knowledge, reason, imagination, history and fiction, symbol and allegory, sacred and profane, natural and supernatural, religious and secular, religion and nature. All of these binaries wouldn't necessarily make sense, right? He says in a more recent book, he says, for example, that binaries emerged from the colonial encounter to distinguish the superior Europeans from the inferior others of modernity. We're getting back to my initial point here. The pagan idolater of the 16th and 17th centuries later becomes secularized as superstitious or primitive. You're not a pagan anymore. You're not an idolater or you're heathen. You're superstitious or you're primitive. Or maybe you're underdeveloped. Or maybe you lack democracy. Or maybe you're a patriarchal Muslim homophobe. I don't know. You find these ways of always putting down the same usual suspects, you see. Right? According to your regime of truth, which is à la mode, okay? I've added some stuff to this thing. The usual suspects stay in need of European salvation. Universal reason asserts its power when it removes the sacred power from certain things, according to Assad. It profanes them and assigns them to others. So instead of having sacred this, sacred that, you have sacred human rights, right? To be enforced and protected even by violent means when necessary, right? So he says it was in the late 19th century that anthropological and theological thought, I'm quoting him here, that rendered a variety of overlapping social usages rooted in changing and heterogeneous forms of life into a single immutable essence and claimed it to be the object of a universal human experience called religious. It's only in the 19th century that all these various things get categorized as one essential, okay, it's called religion, and now we have the study of religion, which is the department where I come from, right? He says the supposedly universal opposition between sacred and profane, for example, finds no place in pre-modern writing. He says in medieval theology, the overriding antinomy was between the divine and the satanic, both of them what we would now call transcendent or supernatural, right? Or the spiritual and temporal, the spiritual and this world, right? Both of them worldly, but not between supernatural, sacred, and natural, profane. It wasn't the dichotomy we had in the medieval European context, right? So this is the deconstruction of religion. I want to talk about multiple approaches to reality, but this, I think we've just been through a mouthful. We've talked about a few theorists. Let's see if we have any questions or comments. I'm sorry, I think it's a little too dense. I apologize.
So just, again, everyone, feel free to raise your hand or add to the chat. I'm sorry, Fatima and I are also in the chat trying to like work through parts of it.
You're welcome to ask questions as well.
So feel free to our audience members, if you have any questions, then we can keep going.
We also actually do have your some books that we will be posting on our page also that like you referenced, like the Genealogy of Religion by Talal Assad, and then I think there's a couple more. So you guys can stay tuned for that. Also, like some of the ones that you've been citing, we have, and we will be posting.
I think everything I'm citing today, I gave you the list, but except Peter Bayer. You might want to add Peter Bayer's book.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what we're saying, in a nutshell, is what we now understand as religion. That word that, after all, Latin or, etymologically, it's not, it doesn't come from India. It's not a Semitic word. It's a Western European origin. And over centuries, it has come to mean different things. Today, that binary of secular versus religious, right, is a completely constructed category which never existed before, even in the West, and which we need to decolonize because it is used to peripheralize the same usual suspects, you see. Right? So global decolonization requires, this is my suggestion to consider multiple approaches to reality. Global decolonization requires contesting and replacing such modern colonial categories as the religious and the secular. Instead of conceptualizing religions revolving around and organized by secular science, we should simply acknowledge that to approach reality, humans draw upon diverse ways of being, knowing, and behaving, right? I've said it again, I'm saying it again to to drive this home. This is my point. My suggestion is that we speak to multiple approaches to reality rather than religion and secular science. Whereas the early modern conquistadors justified their actions as God's work, secular humanists tend to present themselves as rational beings committed to the pursuit of objective and culturally neutral knowledge. Although such pretensions have been undermined by decades of postmodern, postcolonial, and decolonial critique, most Western and Westernized academic institutions around the world still privilege secular science produced in the core of the world system. Try producing and getting an article published without referencing anybody from the core of the world system. See how far it goes, okay? Intellectual traditions from the periphery are categorized as religion, magic, custom, and other labels which imply subjectivity and cultural particularism. Pre-modern Christian theology is treated with similar condescension. Within the modern colonial epistemic hierarchy, the West is positioned as the inevitable future of an emancipated and fully secularized West. You will become secular just as our Christian ancestors did, or at least you'll become privatized and individualized, right? You'll do it at home. You won't make noise, right? The West is understood as mature and rational, the rest as juvenile and irrational. But we must reject such Eurocentrism if we are to truly decolonize our minds. To do so, we first need to realize how deeply these colonial dichotomies have been internalized, even by staunch critics of Eurocentrism, to get back to the question about post-colonial theory, who are socially located on the modern colonial periphery, right? After accepting the discomfort of facing our own Eurocentrism, we can proceed to examine the epistemic framework of the extremely diverse intellectual traditions of the world. Having studied comparative religion and culture for decades, I have concluded that all these traditions, including secular humanism, comprise intellectual systems whose rational arguments are based on non-rational premises. All of the systems in the world have intellectual traditions which are rational, but whose premises are non-rational. I didn't say irrational, by the way. These non-rational premises are not necessarily always irrational. They simply represent perceptions of reality achieved by other means than discursive reasoning. For instance, Muslims consider divine revelation to be of a supra-rational nature, extra-rational, higher than the rational mind. It is one of the non-negotiable premises which underlie the entire edifice of Islamic thought, which has produced spectacular advances in nearly every field of knowledge for 14 centuries. The non-rational premise of revelation hasn't prevented Muslims from being scientists and architects and everything else, right? Muslims, Hindus, and indeed most peripheralized peoples around the world tend to acknowledge the non-rational premises of our own epistemologies, you see. We recognize it. Yeah, that's not rational. That's just a non-negotiable premise, right? Allah and the Prophet. Don't touch that, we'll be okay, right? Peace and blessings be upon them. However, secular humanists do not usually acknowledge theirs. Now, there's the problem. We acknowledge our non-rational premises. Secular humanists don't generally do that with their own. And that is a major obstacle to global epistemic decolonization. It is a major problem for those of us who wish to be considered equals rather than juvenile interlocutors by the secular humanists who dominate global research and education and let us in at the table as cute people to be managed and arbitrated by secular reason. You can come here as long as you leave your beliefs at the door and have a secular, rational conversation with us. To decolonize our minds, we must imperatively scrutinize the non-rational premises, often rooted in Christian theology, of secular humanism and so-called objective science. For instance, the belief in progress. It may be morally just and rationally defendable to believe in progress, but it remains a non-rational, perhaps intuitive premise to believe that things are progressing towards a better future. It's just not rational. It may be good, but it's a premise. It's not a rational, it's up for debate, right? Likewise, in the US-American Declaration of Independence of 1776, you have this assertion that all men are created, right? We believe that all men are created equal. It's said that it's a self-evident truth. We believe these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This is a premise, not a rational argument. Honestly, the most self-evident truth I can empirically observe is that no two human beings have ever been born equal, men or women. When I look around, I don't see anybody who's equal to anybody else. Convincing me otherwise would require a rational argument based on an intuition or a sentiment, such as hope. To be clear, I'm not denying secular humanists the right to believe in progress or equality, but I do wish to shatter the modern colonial binary, which associates universal knowledge with the core and parochial beliefs with the periphery. Moreover, all things are not equal or symmetric. Secular humanism does not only comprise non-rational premises, which might be quaintly compared with those of Islam or Zoroastrianism, it also comprises irrational and violent premises which legitimize the ongoing destruction of alternate ways of being, knowing, and behaving. Right? So this is where we go to our decolonial theories. It's not equal. Right now, in today's system, the dominant destructive force, the most dominant, the most destructive, is like what Talal Asad says. We got to look at the modern nation state, at the secular logic behind it. Argentinian-born philosopher of liberation Enrique Dussel writes of the myth of modernity as the irrational side of modern reason. He explains that senseless violence and genocidal conquests are premises upon which modern reason is built. He says, I'm going to quote, I know I'm getting long-winded, but this is good stuff, guys, please. By controlling, this I'm quoting Dussel, by controlling, conquering, and violating the other, Europe defined itself as discoverer, conquistador, and colonizer of an alterity, likewise constitutive of modernity. Europe never discovered descubierto, this other as other, but covered over, encubierto, the other, as part of the same. It didn't discover the other, it covered the other with its sameness, i.e. Europe. Modernity dawned in 1492, and with it the myth of a special kind of sacrificial violence which eventually eclipsed everything that, whatever was non-European. Destroying human diversity, folks, and covering what remains with European sameness is not reasonable. It is not an attitude conducive to the pursuit of objective truth, yet it is a central premise of modern colonial secular thought, which needs to be uncovered. The irrational, violent myth of modernity, of sacrificing who you are to finally become Western, modern, progress, right? He says, Dussel, if we want to unmask modernity, it is necessary to reveal the fallacy of the myth of reason by showing its other side. That is violence, always carried out and at the same time always denied. Moreover, it implies the recognition of the victims of this civilizing project as innocent victims capable of revealing the false innocence of modernity in its process of the conquest of the other. Revealing the adverse side of modernity is equivalent to showing difference, alterity, as the free existence of the other. Hence, the modern world is a world of conquerors and conquered, in which the innocence of the guilty was assumed, and the guilt of the innocent, the conquered, was assured. Check it out. Hence, the modern world is a world of conquerors and conquered, in which the innocence of the guilty was assumed, and the guilt of the innocent, the conquered, was assured. So those of you who know Malcolm X will hear some of what Malcolm X is talking about. They'll have you believing that the oppressed is the oppressor and the oppressor is the oppressed, right? With this, the injustice with which the civilizing project has been carried out for the past 500 years becomes obvious, is the end of that quote on Dussel. So, right, he's saying this whole thing is based on an irrationally violent, destructive premise. Modern reason has its irrational myth that we need to destroy. It's not the same as other myths. We're not saying the other myths couldn't become that way, but right now it's the elephant in the room that we're talking about, right? So recognizing now we're back to me, recognizing the diverse others destroyed or concealed by modern colonial reason entails acknowledging both the non-rational and rational dimensions of their intellectual traditions. It involves accepting that humans have developed multiple approaches to reality with distinct epistemologies. Of course, protecting this diversity from the ongoing genocides and epistemicides perpetrated by the West and its westernized allies should not entail eliminating the West or its intellectual traditions. We're not talking about that. As a Muslim, I insist that the supra-rational premises of the Islamic tradition cannot justify responding to genocide by genocide or epistemicide by epistemicide, even though some might propose rational arguments to do so. Some Muslims might say that, let's go destroy them. Let's go kill every last one of them, right? I'm saying my tradition doesn't actually allow for it. Our morality is not up for debate, right? So, however, having said that, without destroying Western secular thought, we do need to decenter and somewhat deflate its relative significance on a global scale, while recentering and somewhat reinflating the deflated and peripheralized intellectual traditions of the world. We need to get some balance here. Give more importance to the things that are like peripheralized and send a little bit to the periphery, the things that are taking up all the room, right? And this entails both favoring dialogues with scholars from various non-Western traditions and allowing more room for non-Western perspectives in the dialogues which occur in each of our minds. Each of us needs to become less infatuated with the idea of the West and avoid evaluating our worth through negative or positive comparisons with the West. To be considered academic, a discussion need not include a secular humanist. A secular rationality need not dominate our thought processes as scholars. A whole world of partially overlapping and partially contradicting rationalities and intellectual traditions awaits us. Let's start talking between, Maliki, Sunni, Muslims, and Anishinaabe leaders, for example. Let's get Taoists and 12er Shias to talk. I said there are other conversations are possible. It doesn't always need to be arbitrated by modern secular reason. There are worlds to discover, but first we need to reconnect to our own traditions if we are to make any contribution to interepistemic conversations other than secular humanism poorly disguised by Islamic, Hindu, whatever terminology. It's easy to just use Arabic words, but still it's very important that we reconnect to other epistemic traditions, to the knowledge of our elders, of our predecessors, and really, really question the way we see the world. Really wonder how much we are internally, how much we've internalized, other ways of being and other ways of seeing the world, so that we at least know what our genealogy is, and then we can contribute to a real conversation. If you're going to just go and everybody's going to be like, just speaking other languages, but you can hear Foucault and Marx behind in the bottom of that conversation, that's not an interepistemic dialogue. That's a secular humanist dialogue disguised with multiculturalism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sparks. Okay, did we want to jump into the question? Did anybody have other questions? We have a question here waiting. We'll give you guys also a minute to.
I'm going to get Dilraj to come up as a panelist. Dilraj is like one of our newest research assistants, and he's asked a really exciting question. So Dilraj, thank you for joining us, and I'd like you to ask your question directly.
Sure. Hi, Professor. This is actually my first time listening to your remarks, and it was very, very cool and very refreshing to hear some of the things you said. I love the opinion of also not referring to like Western scholars and works when we're conducting research, because I do feel like a lot is left out. And my question was, when we look back to like the eradication of knowledge, I forgot the exact term you used, but like what are the prospects of that lost knowledge being recovered and re-emerging in the diaspora? And especially in the Sikh tradition, we had a lineage called Gyaniya di Samprada, which basically would take our traditions from the times of Guru Gobind Singh and pass it on as it was passed on to them. So that was supposed to be the most originalist form, but that's really disregarded in today's community. You also mentioned like Christian being most Christ-like, yet if you refer to someone as not being a Sikh, when they do things that are anti-Gurmat or anti-like Rat Maryada, they get offended because they still want to identify as Sikh. So those things getting lost in definition and our perceptions of religion being so much more loose in the Western world. Do you think it's possible for this lost knowledge to re-emerge, first of all? And if it does, what are the chances that it's original?
Thank you so much. It's epistemicide, by the word that was the epistemic meaning knowledge, right? Epistemicide is the destruction of ways of knowing. So you see, what unites us, all of these peripheralized traditions, what unites us is the dominant hegemon, right? That's where we're united. But where we're coming from and how we are affected by it is completely diverse. So I can't give a universal answer to that. That's up to everybody. So you see, the level of destruction is different. Alhamdulillah, Muslim traditions, we still have, I can speak about my tradition, we still have intact lineages of scholarship which people can say, I learned at the feet of, who learned at the feet of, who learned at the feet of, who learned at the feet of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We still have these lineages, right? They're intact. They're peripheralized. You don't make a lot of money, by being a traditional Islamic scholar. Your mom would say, why didn't you become an engineer like your cousin? What, you want to be the sheikh of the masjid? What, you don't want to, especially if you're in Morocco or Egypt, or, it doesn't bring in the bread. And so it's not, unfortunately, by the way, not the best creative minds go to these jobs, because they're often the very last jobs on the totem pole. So there's problems there, but the lineages are still there. And we have huge libraries, like the Islamic library. Oh my God, there's so many books. I mean, you go to Mauritania in the middle of the desert, you got villages where literally elders have manuscripts written by medieval sheikhs. They've got them in the back room. So is this the same thing as Aboriginal people in Australia? I don't know. That they'll have to say that. What I can say is, in the case of Muslims, the destruction is not successful. Guess what? There are Muslims in Spain today. Yay! You see, they tried to eliminate Muslims and Jews. The Muslims and Jews are back. Not only that, Europeans are becoming Muslim, right? During the Franco period, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Spanish people said, we don't like this fascist Catholic. Wait a second, I think my ancestors, there's a reason why we have Omar and Ramon and all these things in our language. I think maybe my ancestors were Muslim and they became Muslim, right? So what I'm saying is, in our case, but we are, after all, there's a reason why modernity was built against Muslims. It was because Muslims were the biggest players on the block too. It's not easy, right? It wasn't easy. We were a big, multifaceted civilization with not only one empire, but many empires. How does this compare? Well, it doesn't compare to a religion that has, how many Sikhs are there in the world? Do you know?
I do not. From last time I've checked, there were around 3.5 million, but I don't think that's accurate.
So, 2 billion, right? 2 billion Muslims, right? What, 18, 20, 22 million Jews? I mean, you have to compare the comparable, right? So I don't know. My answer is I don't know, but I do know this. The work needs to be done. And so what we can do, what we can learn from one another, we can groove with our differences. We can learn to love the other for the other, being the other, not trying to make them the same as us. That's one thing we can do. And we can also learn from our similarities. There are similarities, first of all, between our systems. It's always overlapping. After all, we're part of the same world. You see, what we call Allah the real in Islam, right? Al-Haq. It means he's the real. Anything else, so we're all part of this real, reality, right? And Marxists would agree with us, like, the world is the world, right? So there are similarities. But then when you get into the details of exactly how to, I don't know, maybe there are traditions which are, well, there's certainly languages have disappeared. Half of the languages or something have disappeared. They're gone. They're not coming back. I don't know, as are certain insects and certain birds and certain rivers, some things are dead. But some of us, we do need to do the job of preserving. My suspicion is the Sikhs still have some lineages that they can revive, right?
We do have a similar, we do have a map of what we call the Gyan Wali Sampada, which was basically Guru Gobind Singh Ji themselves had taught a group of, if I remember the number correctly, 48 Singhs, the deep spiritual meanings of Guru Granth Sahib Ji, and then that is the lineage that it's been passed down. Not necessarily familial, but you're finding the right heir to this knowledge. and they're able to distribute it. So we do have like grants, texts, manuscripts. It's now giving value to those materials and understanding them through a more, I guess the term I would use is like an Eastern perspective of what religion, spirituality, and a higher being used to be. Because again, when we're influenced by the Western, whether it be the academic system or the logic, I sometimes like to say that we can't always put logic to religion, because some of these things don't fit in the realm of science, whether it be spiritual awakenings or the things you can see once you reach a certain level of we call avastha, like spiritual enlightening. But it's more of attaching value to these things, and specifically in the Western context, so people take them seriously and respect them the way I guess I feel they should be respected. But I do understand the comparable is hard. It's definitely hard, but I mean, I see some of the similarities.
You're gonna have to, you're gonna have to send me an email and tell me what your response to your question was, because I'd really like to know. But really, because but yeah, but by the way, I just want to make it quick, because I see we have a good conversation brewing up in the chat room. I have my dissertation is called Tradition as Flow, is the main decolonial currents in the Muslim Atlantic, but what I mean by tradition as flow is tradition is not conservative, right? We're not trying to hold on to some past, so it's not folklore. It's not like fearfully I want things to stay the way they were in 7th century Arabia. It's not going to happen, man. You're going to get destroyed if you try that, right? And it's not about progress. I'm sorry, this utopian progressive stuff, that's not tradition. Tradition, the way I describe it in an Islamic context now, and I think this probably might have resonances but needs to be tweaked by different other peripheralized traditions. But in an Islamic tradition, I call it a transcendentally inspired flow from the past into the future through the present. It's got to be, it's a flow. It means what's coming from the past is important. It's flowing. And it's not just because it's from the past, it's because it's also, there's a supra-rational, a transcendent dimension to it. That's what the thing is trying to revivify. It's not just the fun of doing what my ancestors did. It's because they're keeping a knowledge of how to connect with the supra, right? And it's going towards the future. So, and the Sufis, by the way, for example, were very good at doing exactly this, of taking what they thought was essential in the Islamic tradition, but making it make sense for different times and places, which is why Sufi music in Senegal is filled with Senegalese drums. You know what I mean? And in India, damn, it sounds a lot like some of Hindustani, the music the Hindus are playing, because they knew how to, I think, have that good balance of a flow, but no, it's not conservative. I hate the idea that tradition being like fundamentalist or conservative. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about folklore. We're not talking about conservatism. We're talking about a forward-going flow. You can't go back.
Thank you.
I'm serious. You do have to eventually enlighten me on your because you seem to be reflecting about something which you're going to continue reflecting about.
Yeah, I think I could say the same. I think it calls into question a lot of the ways that we go about the kinds of work we want to do. So, I mean, how do you study, for instance, Fatima and I both, how do you study Muslims in the West through the West only? And then how do you go about creating those systems or those frameworks for the work that you want to do within your communities if they don't exist already, or if they were not given credence long enough that they have fallen out of use or fashion?
In the case of Muslims, I just want to say that a lot of the progressive discourse right now of decolonial Muslim thought, if you go to the Muslim periphery, or you go to our grandmothers and grand aunts, they will consider a lot of what we're talking about to sound very colonial. They'll be like, wow, that's a real Western way of thinking you're trying to impose on me there, my friend, right? So you go with a lot of the radical ideas that you think are very decolonial. You go to Morocco and speak to the people who are on the periphery of the periphery, the old women. There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, I think it's a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, says, the religion of old women, right? It's the religion of old women that always gets kicked out the first by modernists or fundamentalists. So I'm suggesting maybe, and I'm damn serious about it. Go and see what old women have to say, and there's a lot of reconnecting you can do there. Different ways of approaching our traditions than just maybe the I don't know.
Definitely.
But I don't think Foucault makes a lot of sense to a lot of our grandmas,
No, definitely not. And I think that's also the issue that we find, since a lot of us do community work as well. It's that when we bring these kinds of knowledges that seem to, as you said, like be unsettling within like our own understanding, but seem to at least start to explain what's, the way the world works. It seems really unreasonable or irrelevant to a lot of our communities. And that's like the first cue that this is like maybe a form of knowledge that's not helpful or not meant for our own people.
I mean, let's see some of the things. Let's continue this, but let's see some of the other. I see 8, the number 8 on the chat. So I think there's a few other questions.
Oh, it was me messaging around with our attendees, but I know there's a couple. I'm sure of our attendees, if any of you want to maybe jump up like Dilraj did, feel free, and then just maybe raise your hand, and then I can like pull you up, and then feel free to keep your camera on or off. But I'd also like to hear from there's a couple of our research assistants also in the chat, or sorry, in the attendees. I'd like to hear like how this kind of like what Dr. Sparks has talked about, how that kind of informs, or how that could inform like the work that you all are doing, your own research as well. Okay, and I'm gonna pull you up, Ida. So I think we could get like a little bit more interaction. Hi, assalamu alaikum, how are you?
Walaikum assalam. How are you guys? I actually had a question. I didn't want to talk about my research, but now that you bring that up, I kind of wanted to, there was some relationship there too. I had a question. I was wondering, you were talking about trying to elevate or trying to lift up those voices from the periphery, but I'm wondering how you would propose to do that given like the power dynamics between the core and the periphery and other things going on, not just genuinely within scholarship, but like a more broad discussion, like concerning folks who aren't in academia.
Again, the analysis is easy, right? Well, it's not easy, but it's easier. But a lot of this depends on your privilege and your positionality, how much you can do, how far you can go. I'm a Muslim, but I got a lot of privilege too, so there's things I can say and still pay my rent. If I know, for having lived in Morocco, where there's no employment insurance, there's no retirement, you don't have a social network. If you say certain scandalous things and you lose your job because of it, you die. The next thing you know, your wife and kids are like going to your wife's family, and you end up begging on the streets. This is what happens, right? So I mean, I'm not going to go around giving universal solutions. It's hard, but the idea, the general idea, is to try to push as far as we can to mention Sheikh so-and-so or Sheikha so-and-so and his or her knowledge about the environment or war or peace or whatever, this with the same authority as I would mention some secular white dude, you see? And then to specify, when I speak about some secular white dude, to specify their particularity. You see, because everything we says has both universal and particular aspects to it. It's just we need to inflate the universality of deflated positions and deflate. You see what I mean? It's not that what I'm actually, what I'm actually saying as a Muslim is, necessarily more universal than what a white secular theorist is saying. But it needs to be, we need to remind people that there's a universal dimension to when you're speaking Islamically. And we need to remind people that there's a parochial or regional dimension when people are speaking from other traditions. So it depends who you are, where you are, how much you can do it. Interestingly, and I think there was something in the chat room about this, interestingly, there are things we can do in the West that you can't do in the periphery, because, subhanAllah, in some places, like, being secular and part of the elite, and even being an atheist or whatever, in places like Morocco and Egypt, are sometimes like really seen as status symbols. And so to go and quote like the grandmothers who go and visit Sufi mausoleums and put candles and stuff, it would be a career ender for you if you're part of a humanities or philosophy department in Morocco, right? And yet here in the West, you can kind of get away with a lot of stuff, right? So and that's and good. Let's use our privilege, and let's not be condescending. Realize that everybody's doing what they can within their limits. Not saying, oh, look at we but it is interesting. You look at a guy like Ibn Arabi. Wow, you want to talk about epistemology? Look at Ibn Arabi. Well, William Chittick, just down the road in New York State, is doing great work on Ibn Arabi. You could probably not get away and be considered a serious scholar in a humanities or social science department in Morocco and write the sort of books he's writing. You'd just be considered like, that's not upper class, man. That's weird. And then you'd have all the fundamentalists coming after you too, in a way, which it's not happening here. So you'd be stuck. You'd be like, you'd have no friends. But you push it a little bit.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And
yeah, and I think it connects back to Dr. Sparks, you were talking about earlier, like this like internalized like colonialism that we that is very apparent, especially in like the academic work. I can say, like, for instance, in Pakistan, the climate change theology, as niche as it is, it doesn't talk to the people that are doing the active construction of that theology, or they aren't talking to the people that are living through the effects of climate change in that country in a very niche way. But
and this is why I've written, and some of you might be interested in my decolonizing, what is it? Mistrust of foxes and wolves, decolonizing the left and the right, or something like that. Anyway, in the Maidan, I've written, it's free. You don't even have to have a subscription or anything to a journal. In which I think this is one of the things we need to realize. The decolonial theory is very, very soft on the left, guys. And presents leftist progressive ideas as being decolonial. They are not. The left is just as colonial as the right. Okay? And it just depends where you are in the world. But believe me, the people who have a progressive discourse in places like Morocco, I mean progressive as Western progressive left, they are generally part of the corrupt elites which are exploiting the hell out of people for whom that left-right dichotomy doesn't make any sense to begin with. It wasn't right. It wasn't created for Morocco. It wasn't theorized in Morocco. It had to do with France and what was going on in the French Revolution. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. And yet these things, you have agendas from the progressive left, or the pseudo progressive left in some cases, which will take away money, which will have financial and political and geopolitical repercussions on countries in Africa, right? So our preoccupations are not the same, is what I'm saying. And so we need to decolonize the left and the right.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess I have a follow-up question to that, if that's okay. So then how do you prevent the co-optation of this knowledge? I don't know if you used that word, but I think you spoke about it briefly as well.
The co-optation of what knowledge? Sorry, just to be clear.
Of like discourse coming from the West that seems to be Islamic or with a specific tradition in mind, but is actually, it is inherently colonial.
Yeah. Well, it's like, you got to know context, right? Like, when I came back from Morocco, like where we have family and where we have a home in Morocco is right on the Strait of Gibraltar. It's 19 kilometers away from Europe, and people have been dying trying to cross that strait. There's the fishermen on the coast of northern Morocco. They have a saying "Al-Bahr ma shaba' bani Adam." The sea has still not filled its belly with the corpses of the children of Adam, because they keep pulling up black corpses, sub-Saharan African corpses in their nets, right? So why am I bringing this up? People from Yemen, from Syria, from sub-Saharan Africa, and increasingly from within Morocco right now, especially with COVID, they end up in the north of Morocco, in the mountains around where my in-laws are from and where I have a home. And they had these little refugee camps in the woods, and they're waiting to cross over. Okay. And they're being exploited by everybody, man. They're being exploited by the mafia, by the cops, by the army, it's a terrible, terrible condition to be in. And when I came back from Morocco and I came to Laurier, and at first kind of habituated myself with what the discourse was. At the time, there was raging debates about bathrooms and gender, right? And I was thinking to myself, if I were to go back and sit around the campfire with some of these, Senegalese dudes that I came across and we occasionally have conversations with in the woods, they'd be like, bathrooms? Running water? What? You got that? What are you angry about? You know what I mean? It's like their perspective is so different. What seems like a burning issue, to me, is just like, like I used to say, and I don't mean this to be condescending, because it really is an important issue for some people. But what we consider microaggressions, if we were undergoing macroaggressions, they would not have the same importance. Discourse is important, symbolism is important, statues is important. I'm not saying this is not important stuff. I'm just saying that if you're in those woods, in those mountains, and you've been raped, and I don't even, or if you're from Palestine and you're, or if you're from Yemen, I don't know, keep the statue up, put it down. I don't know, man. I'm getting bombed, man. And I'm getting bombed by Democrats, and I'm getting bombed by Republicans. You know what I'm saying? I got bombed by Obama more than I did by what's that other guy's name? Trump, in some cases, right? Some people are like, what? I don't know. I didn't see much of a difference. Doesn't matter to me. The bombs didn't taste any sweeter under Obama. They didn't. So it depends where you are. And that's what we need to be aware of, to get back to your question. Context. Who is pushing a discourse for what reason, wherever it is. But here's the thing. When we take big guns and deconstruction and post-structuralism, for example, these are big guns that were used against Eurocentrism and the dominant Eurocentric tradition, right? These are big intellectual guns that just rip stuff apart. When you take that and you take it to extremely fragilized institutions in the Islamic world, for example, and apply that same level of destruction to try and counter real problems, misogyny and whatnot, you can do so much destruction because they're already fragile. They're not the global hegemon. You know what I'm saying? Al-Azhar in Cairo is not Colombia. You go in there shooting deconstruction and post-structuralism and that stuff, it's just not right. It's just not right. It's bullying because they're already fragilized. I'm not saying we shouldn't be pushing back against problems. I'm just saying you got to have a gun which is appropriate for the fight. You know what I'm saying? Don't take a gun to a knife fight. I don't know, something like that. But you hear what I'm saying, right?
And I think, sorry, Ida, did you want to say something else?
No, I was just going to say thank you. Yeah, go for it, Fatima.
Yeah, thanks. I was actually going to say that we will also be linking your article, Dr. Sparks, the one of the wolves and foxes. It's super insightful. It's like we'll be sharing it on the page, and we can probably even send it as a follow-up of sorts, because it's super important, especially on this finishing note that this last question. So we just wanted to kind of put out like any more questions, final call before we wrap up.
But we definitely want you back again very soon. Inshallah, we'll be bugging you for like some follow-up kind of conversations, especially I think at least the research assistants and Kira and Fatma and I want to bug you a lot more. So especially about like, especially the work that the DLP is doing in general, and where to go from here in terms of, decolonizing.
Yeah, this topic was super essential to essentially our entire premise and all our, like the whole point of our project, right? Like we can't essentially begin our project without the foundation of what exactly you were talking about. So while you did keep calling it dense, it's like exactly what we needed, right? And like hopefully we can kind of continue to elaborate on it, because it's difficult to envision what a decolonized library project would look like without these stepping stones. So thank you for your time, Dr. Sparks, and thank you for this talk.
Can I just follow up on
Yeah.
maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, because it's an important topic. There was an article written by decolonization is not a metaphor, right? You know the article I'm talking about. And what they say is, look, decolonization is not social justice. It's not trade unionism. It's not feminism. It's not this, is not that. It's not giving us back our freaking land, period. Don't collapse our struggle into yours, right? Now, can you want to do this and that? Of course, right? But don't appropriate one struggle into another. Don't collapse one struggle into another. All right. So this was the perspective of Indigenous people, right? So I think for Indigenous people, and I think here in Turtle Island, that's a real important thing. It's about the land, what their traditions are, whether they seem whatever to us, patriarchal or not, or whatever or not, or this or that or not. That's their business. The business is give them their land back. That's what decolonization is. Now, as a Muslim, we come from a different experience. We're a global religion, and we discovered as Muslims, that when we got our land back in places like Morocco or Turkey, or well, Turkey had their land for most of it, but yeah, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, India, that we got the land back, but the colonization never stopped. Getting your land back, we discovered, was not enough. That's our experience, right? And I'm not saying that contradicts the experience here. I'm just saying the Muslim experience as a global religion, as a super cosmopolitan religion, one in which belonging is not necessarily linked to the land, but it's linked to the saying of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, right? You can come from wherever you like. Once you say that, you're Muslim. Our experience of decolonization was that you can be decolonized, you can get your land back apparently, but you don't have sovereignty really over that land. They left your land, but you're still in this global colonial system, right? And so what I would say as a Muslim, and I'm not contradicting the Indigenous perspective, I'm saying as Muslims, and perhaps Buddhists and Hindus and people from whose traditions originate in the old Eurasian African continental landmass, for us, I think decolonization, we need to expand it a bit from just the question of land, but we do need to still delimit it and say decolonization is just getting Western-centric constructs out of our ways of being, knowing, and behaving, not having them dominate us, not have them be hegemonic. Whether the result at the end of that is good or bad, is just or not, is another question. You see, decolonization is just getting Eurocentrism the hell off of the back of our necks. That's decolonization. All the other struggles, you might want to join in them or not. I don't know, right? But decolonization is about that. So yeah, for example, I think we need to struggle against misogyny, right? I really think so, but not with a new sexual regime coming and imposed upon us from Western universities. We need to look deep within our tradition how we can figure that out. And the point I'm really trying to make is we can't do it as long as the colonial boot is on our neck. We can't have a real conversation about family, about sexuality, about progress, about Sufism, about fundamental. We can't have that conversation as long as we've got boots on our necks, and we got them intellectually, socially, and etc. Right? So decolonization must not become co-opted as a Eurocentric leftist project, not for Muslims. Maybe it works in Latin America. I don't know. I know that the Latin American school tends to be very Marxist in their genealogy, and I understand that and I respect that. But I think that for Muslims, you see, I know my wife's ancestors in the north of Morocco were not any happier when it was socialists or in the Spanish Civil War. A lot of them were on the side of Franco. A lot of them were on the sides of the fascists because they thought the communists, if they got in, would destroy religion in the colonies. So they considered the fascists to at least be respectful of Islam. And I'm not going to tell them they were wrong. Maybe the fascists were better for them. That was a lot of people thought, Franco's better for us than the commies. Because the communists are against religion. And if the communists come in, they're gonna impose us their secular views. You see what I mean? So I'm no fan of Franco, by the way. Right? I'm just saying, I don't know, right? So this is the thinking I think we need to be having as Muslims, just as the indigenous people are saying, look, don't collapse it into something else. Make it about land. I'm saying don't collapse it into something else. Make it about removing Western hegemony or hegemony. How's it? Hegemony. And having a conversation and reaching a point where we can begin to have a conversation rooted in our own genealogies. And I think we will discover that we have a lot of resources, at least in the Islamic tradition, to deal with misogyny and injustice and corruption and sexual diversity and all of these things. We will find our resources within our own discourse and within our own traditions, and we'll be able to adapt it to our circumstances and into the future, inshallah. And the Hindus will be able to do the same, and the Buddhists will be able to do the same, inshallah. But you need to do that. You have to have a space where you don't have a colonial boot on your neck. And you literally can't breathe. This is what Frantz Fanon was saying. That I can't breathe. This is not new. This is not new. This is what we've been saying. How can I have a conversation when I can't breathe? You're asking me to do things. I can't breathe, man. People can't breathe. They're drowning in the Mediterranean, folks. And you're asking them about gendered bathrooms? I'm going to swear, so I'm going to stop now. Fuck no. You can erase that from them. You know what I'm saying? You can't have these conversations. You cannot have, and you can't impose them on people. You got to start by decolonizing. You have to. There is no ending misogyny or sexual violence or corruption or anything right now for Muslims. I'm convinced of it. Or for Sikhs or for Hindus, I'm convinced of it. Or for Buddhists, without first saying, stand back, Western theory. Step back. Let me breathe, really. Foucault, thank you very much. Stand back. Derrida, go over there. Gramsci, love you. Over there, please. I need to start hearing words like Ibn Arabi, Sayyid al-Hurra. You see, I need to start hearing words that sound like that resonate with what I do when I pray and when I worship. And I need to find myself in my own environment before I can have conversations with others. So this would be my advice to your project, since it's at its early stages, to really think about that, to not become co-opted by the left or the right. I don't fear you'll become co-opted by the right, though, you see. That's why, you see, I push hard against the left because I'm not worried about the right. You know what I'm saying? I don't think most decolonial thinkers are about to become Tories and Trump supporters, and I maybe, but so if we did, I'd be worried. My final words to you is think of Brother Malcolm, who said, I prefer to see the teeth of the wolf because at least I know he's growling and wants to eat me. But the fox who pretends that he's smiling, he also wants to eat me. And I fall asleep with their lullabies, you see. I fall asleep with the left and their lullaby. We love you, Muslims. We love multiculturalism. Oh, that's such a nice scarf. What? That's what you really believe? Give us your children. Literally, give us your children. Literally, give us your children, right? Did I get excited towards the end here?
That was perfect. I'm really glad that you had these final comments, because
perfect finishing note. Yeah, because we do need like it's good to end off on a future direction, right?
It's the institutional left center people who are after your kids, by the way. They're after, social services and all these people who are trying to they're after Somali kids, they're after indigenous kids. And when they hear the Arabic, even if you look like me and your kid's name is Muhammad, if my boy Muhammad goes and he acts a little violent at school or something, believe me, he gets constructed and he triggers different things than if his name was Jerome, right? And so it really is a matter of life and death for our families to really consider that, we love everybody. Everybody has a possibility of redemption. As Muslims, we believe everybody has good in them. We believe that Christians and atheists and everybody have a good core. We don't want to, have a violent interaction with people. We want to get along well, but we do have people who mean us harm on the left and the right. And it's not because they're singing lullabies and telling you your headscarf looks good and asking you for couscous recipes or shawarma or biryani recipes that they really have your best intentions, really have your best intentions at heart. And they can be more dangerous because you fall asleep at the wheel when they're there. They love us. They love Muslims. No, they don't. I really want to see the numbers about how many Muslims were getting prevented from getting through the border under Obama versus Trump. I really want to see those numbers. I'm not convinced that the Muslim ban under Trump was that much worse than it was under Obama. I'd like to see. I don't know, but I'm not convinced. I'm really not convinced. Right? And those of you, and Palestine and Yemen, I know people are like, at least Trump wasn't starting new wars, man. I know, I've heard the discourse. I see it on my Facebook feed. It comes from Egypt, comes from Syria, comes from Yemen. They're like, Trump didn't start any new wars. That's what they're saying, man. It's another perspective, right? And I don't love Trump, believe me.
Yeah. But yes, a very truthful one, and also one that we also hear
in your own Facebook feeds, right?
Yeah. And from people back home. Yeah.
Right.
We're trying to get through the borders, and it's no different, And the hatred is no different. It's just a different form of it. Even in America, I now live in America. It's not any different. It's just
now live in America. Okay, we'll have to have that conversation once we're not being recorded. But anyway, there you go, right? And I think even there was a picture of kids being in cages under ice, which they discovered was actually from the previous administration, and they tried to anyway. So come on, guys.
Yeah, and there was no fixing it with the new administration either, right? Like it became really big with the old one, and then with the new one, it kind of just sunk under the radar. So. Yeah,
I'm saying I don't trust Biden. I don't trust Trudeau, but I don't trust the anarchists and the radical wokes. I don't trust anybody. I'll trust everybody. I'll give you a chance, but you can't come at me with another regime of truth and earn my trust right away. You can't. We have to apply our critical reasoning and our love and our compassion and our which Muslims have always done. We've always had interactions. We've always been a cosmopolitan civilization. And the times we didn't do that well. Right? So, I'm not talking about insularism, but come on now. Come on now.
And on that note.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sparks.
Thank you so much.
But we do look forward to having you again.
Peace. Thank you.
Thank you so
much. And thank you to all of our participants, and we'll be in touch soon with our next event.
And we'll be posting this one, and stay tuned for all the book suggestions that have come out of that conversation.